It is 5 degrees outside on the day I'm recording this in Texas. Help. So as has been made immensely clear by this point, the X-Men are my favorites. And even though I credit the comics with my falling in love with them, what I consider to be my first true introduction to who the X-Men really are came from the early 90s cartoon adaptation, X-Men the Animated Series. So if you're familiar with the X-Men at all, then you probably know at least a little bit about this show. It's probably the most well-known adaptation of the X-Men after the films, and it was a lot of people's introduction to these characters. And I think that's great, because this show is awesome. I've said before that I consider X-Men Evolution to be the best adaptation of the X-Men, but this show is a very, very close second. And today, we're going to talk about why.
First of all, that opening. It quickly and beautifully establishes not just the X-Men and their powers, but even villains like Magneto and the general idea of anti-mutant sentiment. And all set to that music. I mean, what can I say? One of the most iconic superhero themes of all time, and by far the best theme ever given to the X-Men. Although I am rather fond of the X-Men anime theme song. And yes, that is a thing.
But moving past the opening, let's get into the show itself. In my previous discussions of X-Men adaptations, I kept my focus mainly on the characters and how they were portrayed, and of course I'm going to be doing that here as well. I think it's especially important to discuss these versions of the characters because for many people, this show is what solidified their views on these particular X-Men.
To start us off in the cast order of the aforementioned iconic opening, let's look at Cyclops. He's pretty much exactly what you would expect for this character, a serious, hard-working leader who's always screaming about Jean. But speaking honestly, this is probably the most comic-accurate version of Cyclops we've seen from anything, and really my only objection is that we don't get to see much past the surface level of team leader who always follows the rules. Not that that's really an issue, and it is a kid's cartoon, so you really shouldn't be expecting deep dive character studies or anything like that. You could see him as a little more bland than the other characters for that reason, but for what he is, I think he works just fine. I do honestly really like how they show his kind of dry, snarky sense of humor, and it never feels like he's being held back in order to make Wolverine look cooler. So while I do think that I personally preferred the Evolution version of Cyclops, this one is still pretty good, especially if you're looking for one that's a little more like the comics. Alright, next is the Golden Boy himself, Wolverine. And if we're being honest, this show kind of started the trend of Wolverine is the most important one and we must focus on him more than anyone else. Now don't get me wrong, this is nowhere near a situation like the movies, where the other characters are actively sacrificed in his favor, but he does get far, far more episodes focused on him than anyone else. And you can really tell that they are going hard on, look how cool Wolverine is.
And that's something that I've honestly always found to be really strange. Like, this is a show for children, to the degree that we aren't even allowed to use the word die half of the time, and where you definitely aren't allowed to, stab and slice people. And you have this character whose whole power set is cutting people open. It's a very awkward situation, because Logan threatens people with his claws all the time, but he never, ever uses them on an actual human being. Robots are fair games, but actual people, even evil ones, that's a no-no. Which makes it really, really awkward when he's fighting Sabretooth, and we have these two characters whose whole thing is that they have claws, and they can't use their claws. It's a bit of a nitpick, I realize, and it's honestly not that big of a deal, but I just really do think it's weird how they keep pushing Wolverine in media intended for children. But enough of that, let's talk about his actual characterization.
Like many characters on this show, this Logan is also very accurate to the comics. He's cranky and aggressive, but he secretly cares about people, and it's just as endearing here as it is anywhere. It did kind of stick out to me though, especially in the first season, that he can be really, really immature. Like, he just antagonizes people for no reason at all, and sometimes you're just like, dude, get over yourself. Not to say he isn't like that in the comics, but I guess I'm just remembering him as being a little more reasonable. It does get a little better as the show progresses, so maybe it was a sort of character development, but that's just something that stuck out to me. Overall, this Wolverine is still really good and really entertaining. His casting is perfect, and even if his lack of using his claws is somewhat jarring once you notice it, they most certainly accomplished their goal of making Wolverine look cool. Because he just is. Our next team member is Rogue, and I am so grateful to this show for showing me what Rogue is actually like. Everything you could want to see her. She's a powerhouse who always contributes to the team, she's confident and lively, and oh boy, is the sass strong with this one. It's great, and I love her here. Her casting is a little like, it's not bad, and I totally get what they were going for, but there are times when you're just kind of like, alright. But yeah, I really don't have too much to say because I feel like I would just be repeating myself for my top 10 X-Men video where I talked about why I loved Rogue, because honestly, she's pretty much lifted right off the page here. Her relationship with Gambit is, of course, lovely, and I'll talk about it a little more when we get to him. They might not explore the full potential of Rogue's character in this show, but overall, she's great.
Wait, did I just get through an X-Men video without ranting about Rogue for 5 minutes? Wow. This is shocking. And now we have our second X-Woman, Storm. Okay, so I'm guessing most of you know by now that I absolutely love Storm. She's one of my most favorite X-Men, and I am very, very salty about how she has been treated in adaptations. Now, in this show, she probably does get more than anywhere else, but it's still not quite what I want.
So in terms of character prominence, Storm is probably about even with any of the other characters. And that's really good, because unfortunately, after this show, basically every other adaptation of the X-Men just pays lip service to Storm's significance without ever actually giving her the chance to really shine. But again, this show still doesn't quite hit the mark. Similar to pretty much everyone else, 90s Storm is overall pretty accurate to her comic book self. My main issue is that she doesn't really feel as down-to-earth as her comic self is. Like, Aurora is melodramatic in the comics too, definitely, but not quite to the degree that she is here. And it is honestly pretty endearing just how over the top she can be, but I feel like this show just doesn't quite capture the awesomeness of Storm's character because you never quite get into her, if you know what I mean. Although there are episodes that focus a little more on Storm than everybody else, I feel like she never quite feels relatable. Like, even though we still love her, she never feels like much more than just that woman who yells at nature a lot.
A ward of rain to quench the flame. Whirlwind, deliver them. Be gone.
It's kind of weird to try and put it into words because I really don't dislike how Storm isn't handled in this show, but I think it just speaks to the broader trend of X-Men adaptations not quite getting her. None of them seem to have managed to perfectly hit the balance between epic goddess and compassionate team member. I don't know. I guess overall I would say that this version of Storm is good, but still lacking in some areas.
But, despite anything negative I may have said, let's just appreciate that this show understood the truth that Wolverine and Storm need to be together. It was only for 2 episodes in an alternate universe, but I'll take it. It's what opened my eyes. The world needs to know. Wolverine and Storm for life.
But to move on, it's time for my boy Beast. And he is just utter perfection here. This show was what made me fall in love with Beast. He's just so cool, so chill, so charming. I've already talked a lot, I think, in my other videos about all the reasons I love Beast, and they really are fully encapsulated here. His casting is perfect, and there's no reason not to like him.
Something I especially like here is that even though they very much demonstrate how calm and collected Hank is, the times where he does get angry don't feel out of place. They usually feel properly built to, and I think that's really cool. I don't know what else to say because he is just great and I absolutely adore him. If you want to experience the true essence of Beast's character, this is the place for it because they honestly just nail it here.
But next up is Gambit, and unfortunately this is the only adaptation of the X-Men to place Remy in a starring role, which I honestly find to be really weird because Gambit is super popular. Maybe they just knew they couldn't beat perfection. Because he's great in this show, is what I mean. Again, flawless casting, and his character is fully present in all of its roguishly charming glory. If you watch this show and you don't come to like Gambit, then I don't know what to tell you.
Now, with all that being said, I do have 1 or 2 issues with his character here. Kind of. His flirtiness does border on perviness at times, and that could just be a case of the show aging a bit poorly, but it is there, and it's kind of weird. And this isn't really an issue or anything, but he does refer to himself in 3rd person, like, almost constantly. Did he do that in the comics? I don't seem to remember him doing that, but I could be wrong.
But slight perviness aside, Gambit is really, really lovable here. They really showcase his sincere care for others underneath his seemingly devil-may-care attitude, and of course, you gotta love him in Rogue, even if he occasionally doesn't know when to take a hint. So in the end, I have very few complaints when it comes to Gambit.
Alright, this next section is where I stop endlessly gushing and things get a little more The next team member is Jubilee. Sweet, sweet Jubilee.
So Jubilee in this show is a pretty divisive character. Generally speaking, you either love her or you hate her. I'm a little more in the middle, personally. I definitely don't love her, but I really couldn't say that I hate her either. But yes, she can be kind of annoying. She is that audience insert tag-along kid type character, and while she can be entertaining, there are times when you're just like, shut up, Jubilation, no one cares. But speaking in terms of how they adapted her character, it's a little bit surprising. As I've already said, nearly every character in the show is practically lifted off of the page, but Jubilee is a little bit different. She's actually kind of toned down here. Because comics Jubilee is a force of nature. She never shuts up, ever, and she also gives off a little more cynical vibe, kind of, than she does here. The best example I can think of is from a comic where, spoiler alert, I guess, Ileana Rasputin dies, and when Jubilee is talking to Jean about it, you can really tell how she's desperately trying to cover up how much it got to her, whereas show Jubilee would just be openly crying about it. So that's what I mean, Jubilee just seems more meek and emotional here. It's a little weird because while Jubilee in the show definitely makes herself heard, she just doesn't feel quite as forceful as she is in the comics. Is that a bad thing? I'm not too sure. Because, well, in either context, she's still rather whiny, because that's just how Jubilee is. But I would argue that in the comics, she's a little bit more entertaining, so she's easier to tolerate than she is here. In some ways, I think they try to conflate Jubilee with Kitty Pryde, a decision that I don't love, but yeah, it is what it is.
In the end, I don't hate Jubilee here, but she is definitely not what I would consider to be one of the show's strong points. Again, you kind of either love her or you hate her, so it kind of just comes down to your personal preference. The next is Jean Grey, and oh boy.
So in this show, Jean Grey is a wimp. She's only marginally more useful in combat than Jubilee, and it seems like she's constantly passing out or crying for Scott or, I don't know, tripping over her own shoelaces, apparently. And that sort of perplexes me, because although Jean started out very weak in the comics, she became much, much stronger, and by the 90s when this show was made, she was definitely one of the strongest members of the team. Like, no, she doesn't have to be going full-bore Phoenix at all times, because Jean is never like that, but she also shouldn't be practically useless.
Even with the issues of her powers aside, this version of Jean Grey just isn't that great. It honestly feels like she gets a lot less focus in comparison to the other characters, and you just really don't get a feel for her personality. Even though this show adapted both the Phoenix Saga and the Dark Phoenix Saga, neither of them really feel that focused on Jean's character. It is there somewhat, but not really as much as I feel like there should be for storylines where Jean is supposedly the principal character.
In the end, I think the show kind of does a disservice to Jean as a character. It feels really regressive in a lot of ways. It seems to be a lot more like her weaker 60s characterization, both in terms of power level and general personality. Except for the Christmas episode. That one was great. I really don't understand why they chose to take this direction with Jean. We can't have 3 strong female characters in the same show, I guess. But it would probably be my biggest gripe with the show overall, because I love Jean, and she deserves more than becoming a meme with how useless she is.
And despite all of the negativity I've just said, I honestly really do like her voice actress. I think you can really tell that she's enjoying herself, and she does pretty good with what she's given. It's just, you know, most of what she's given is screaming. But we've made it to the final main character, Professor Charles Xavier, and he's fine.
This version of Professor X is pretty much the same you'll see anywhere. Responsible leader with faith in humanity and a dream for equality. I can say that I appreciate that this show does actually dive into his character a little more than other TV shows do, but Professor X has never really been my favorite character, so I guess I don't care that much. However, if you're traditionally a fan of Charles, then I think you'd definitely like him here. Again, this is probably the most comic-accurate depiction that we've seen so far, but that isn't always a good thing. There are definitely areas where you feel like you can't trust this guy, which is very comic-accurate. Like, sure, let's leave the inexperienced 13-year-old to babysit the 7-foot-tall homicidal maniac with claws. That sounds like a great idea. Seriously, what the heck, dude?
In all seriousness though, this is a perfectly fine adaptation of Professor Xavier. It hits all the important beats for his character and serves as a pretty good standard for what he's like. Like I said, he definitely isn't my personal favorite, but that's just my personal preference. But yeah, that's all the main characters in the show, and overall, they're all really great. This show isn't too big on like really deep dives or serious character development, but given the context, that's not really an issue. Aside from a few exceptions, these are great representations of who these characters are and how they work. We also get a lot of cameos and featured appearances from several different X-Men characters, which is great, but those tend to be a little more hit or miss in terms of accuracy. Obviously, I don't believe that every character has to be identical, but some of these changes really baffle me.
Like, why is Dazzler a super aggressive flirt? Why is Psylocke a morally ambiguous thief? Why is Angel ashamed of his mutation? Why is Iceman so against the X-Men? And why does Scott hate him? Like, sure, Bobby can be difficult, but they just took it to the next level on this show. None of these changes are bad things necessarily, I just don't understand why they were made. There are other characters though who were pretty great. Bishop, for example, he's cool, and I really love the little harmonica theme that he has. Nightcrawler is also pretty great. A little preachy and missing the more jovial elements of his character, but overall, a pretty decent portrayal. With Colossus, they lean hard into stereotypical foreigner, and they kind of also go for the angle that he's kind of stupid, which I resent strongly. Peter's not stupid, he's simple. There's a big difference. Don't ever speak bad about my son again. Overall though, he's fine, and the smaller character appearances in general are a lot of fun. I should also talk about villains a little bit. I don't want to go super deep into them, but overall, they're pretty great. We of course see the usual iconic ones like Magneto, the Sentinels, Apocalypse, the Juggernaut, frickin' Mystique and the Brotherhood, but we also see some that usually don't get much attention in adaptations. Mr. Sinister, Nimrod, Omega Red, Genosha. We even see people like Sauron, Lady Deathstrike, the Phalanx, even though they're really more like the Technarchy, and of course, Mojo. Best episode ever.
And now, even though I've spent the better half of this video talking about the characters, I should say that the characters themselves aren't really what I consider to be the best part of this show. They're good, as I've said before, but in general I would consider Evolution to have stronger characterization, even if it's in a lot of ways, less accurate. But that doesn't make this show bad by any stretch of the imagination. It just means the reason why I love this show is because of how widely it encompasses the X-Men mythos. The great thing about this show is how unafraid it is to embrace all the aspects of the X-Men, even the ones that are kinda weird. Like I said, we get Mojo and the Savage Land and a lot of the more cosmic stuff that's usually left out of adaptations. And overall, the whole show just feels like a celebration of all of X-Men history up to that point. It also adapts a lot of iconic comic book storylines, even though it usually simplifies them or alters them to make them fit better within the universe of the show. But again, that isn't a bad thing, because sometimes comics can be really unnecessarily complicated. But if you only know the Proteus storyline from this show, you are not prepared for what it's like in the comics.
We of course get the full Phoenix Saga, as I mentioned before. We get Days of Future Past, although Kitty still doesn't get to be the main character.
This is kind of off topic, but that's another one of my very few complaints with this show, that Kitty doesn't get so much of the cameo. Come on, really? Nothing? It just kind of sticks out when you see how many other characters got to have cameos in the show, and Kitty gets absolutely nothing. Anyway, sorry, just needed to throw that out there. Back to the positivity.
Yeah, we also get elements of stories like Extinction Agenda, The Legacy Virus, Fatal Attractions, Weapon X, and even Age of Apocalypse, although that one's a little bit different because the show actually came up with that idea first, and it was then adapted into the comics. So we have the show to thank for the beauty that is Age of Apocalypse.
But yeah, that's what's great about this show. It serves as a great introduction point to the X-Men, because comics are really hard to get into, but this show makes them really accessible. It also wasn't afraid to dive into social issues, which is another thing that we love about the X-Men. It is a show for children, but it wasn't afraid to get a little dark sometimes, and when that's done for the sake of the story, that is something I will always commend. From a technical standpoint, I'll admit it's not great. The animation style is really good, but the quality of it can be kind of cheap. I've praised the casting a lot, and I still stand by that, but the acting itself can be a bit hit or miss. Overall, however, the actors seem to be really having fun with their roles, and it is definitely always entertaining. It should be said that this is a kids' cartoon from the 90s, and it shows, but in many ways the occasional over-the-top cheesiness or awkwardness really just adds to the enjoyment of watching it. Be aware of what you're going into, but if you're looking for a fun time with the X-Men, you will not be disappointed. So yeah, X-Men the Animated Series is a quintessential adaptation for how it celebrates the source material and serves as a great introduction point for someone who has never heard of the X-Men or who wants to learn more about them. Similar to X-Men Evolution, it's not perfect, but it has a lot to offer and is overall just a fun ride from beginning to end. Well, except for Season 5. We don't talk about Season 5. In the end, I'm really glad that we have both this show and Evolution because they complement each other really well in a lot of ways. Evolution focuses a little more on individual characters and relationships, while the 90s show focuses more on different storylines and the general spirit of the X-Men. Both of them are fantastic in their own ways, and I could totally see why someone would prefer this show to Evolution, but I'm just glad that we have both. So yeah, thank you for watching and joining me on another dive into a great X-Men adaptation. Obviously, I recommend this show very highly, so if you've never seen it, definitely give it a try. Thank you again, and I'll catch you next time.